So thank you everyone for joining us again with Kentucky Equine Research. We're doing another awesome webinar with Dr. Katie Young, and she's going to teach us a little bit about tying up today. Dr. Young received her BS degree from Missouri State University in biology, minoring in animal science and chemistry, and earned her PhD degree from Texas A&M University in equine nutrition and exercise physiology. Her graduate research focused on mineral balance in resting and exercise horses and the effects of fat-added diets on sweat production and electrolyte requirements in working horses. Dr. Young was a member of the TAMU Equine Science faculty for several years during and following her tenure as a graduate student, and since leaving academia, Dr. Young has spent more than 20 years in the feed industry as an equine nutritionist, horse feed program manager, and business consultant for Farmland Industries, and then as a technical equine nutritionist for Purina Animal Nutrition. She has extensive experience in horse feed formulation, quality control and production, customer service and communication, sales and sales training, marketing, and regulatory and labeling requirements for equine feed. She was highly involved in every aspect of product development and launches, from ideation to formulation to product production to package design and marketing, sales training, and distribution. Dr. Young currently is a consulting equine nutritionist working for Kentucky Equine Research and is also providing nutrition consultations to veterinarians and horse owners. Dr. Young has been a professional trainer and riding instructor for more than 40 years and continues to do so in the Kansas City area. She specializes in eventing and hunter jumpers. So welcome back, and we're super excited to learn what you have for us today.
Well, thank you so much. And let me get my share screen going. There we go. Okay. I think we're good to go.
I think so.
Cool. So today we're going to talk about tying up in horses, and most specifically in exercising horses, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other diagnosed episodes of tying up. And I have to say, I find tying up really fascinating, but it can also be very complicated because, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we thought it was really pretty simple. And now we realize that it's not simple at all. It's really a complicated thing to understand in horses. So let's see if it will, come on, there we go. I was going to be worried if I couldn't scroll through the slides and I just had to try and talk it all from memory. But okay, so what tying up is, technically it's called, we're going to talk about exertional rhabdomyolysis, which is basically just the dissolution of muscle cells with exercise, or the damage of muscle cells with exercise. And it's not just one specific thing. Tying up, or ER, is kind of like the term colic, that it's a syndrome that describes a lot of different specific types of issues. So a syndrome with many causes, different disease processes with similar appearing symptoms, and the episodes of muscle pain and stiffness. Historically, there have been a lot of different names for this syndrome. It's been called tying up, set fast. Years and years ago, it was Monday morning disease. When I was young, it was called azoturia, then chronic intermittent rhabdomyolysis, and equine rhabdomyolysis syndrome. So lots of different names, but at this point in time, it's considered exertional rhabdomyolysis. And again, that's just the blanket term. Approximately 3 to 13% of exercising horses can exhibit some form of ER or tying up. There are a lot of different factors: exercise routine, sex, age, temperament of horse, diet, lameness, genetics. Some of these diseases actually have been identified, the specific genetic mutation. So there is so much more known about tying up or ER now than years ago, and more is being learned every day. Clinical signs, just what you're looking for, what a horse looks like that is tying up. First off, stiffness in the muscles, firm and painful muscles over the loin and croup, regions of the top line, and including the large gluteal muscles. A lot of times you'll see muscle tremors. Sometimes it's just stiffness and reluctance to move. Sometimes you actually see the fasciculations in the muscles. A lot of times you'll see quick, shallow breathing. The horse's heart rate will increase. Sometimes you get very excessive sweating. Some of these are just indication of the pain that the horse is in. In some of the ERs or muscle myopathies, you'll see shifting hind leg lameness. So you may look at a horse and say, he kind of looks like he's off on the right hind. Gee, last week he kind of looked off in the left hind, and it's just kind of ambiguous. Sometimes you see it, well, most of the times you see a reluctance to move, or in some of these myopathies, you see really more of a reluctance to maintain collection without a lot of the other obvious signs. And then in pretty severe episodes, you can see myoglobinuria, which is dark urine. That's indicative of muscle tissue breaking down, and you get the darkness of the urine, which is the waste products from the muscle breakdown being flushed out in the urine. Now, diagnosis of tying up or ER, of course, there's the clinical signs, muscle stiffness and pain after exercise. And then the veterinarian will usually take, when your horse is tying up, the first recommendation is call your veterinarian. The vet will take a blood sample, most likely, and look for elevations in the serum muscle proteins and enzymes, including the myoglobin, which again is from the damage to the muscle cells, and then creatine kinase, lactate dehydrogenase, and aspartate transferase. Those are enzymes that are again those raised levels in the blood of the proteins and enzymes will indicate that there is muscle tissue damage going on, and of course then the tying up. In severe cases, they may see electrolyte abnormalities in the blood sample. And again, of course, the dark colored urine. And one of the best diagnostic tools is a muscle biopsy, and preferably a muscle biopsy when the horse is going, when the tying up episode is happening. And then those biopsies, the muscle biopsies are, they're stained, and the different staining techniques to look for, and we'll talk a little bit later about different aggregations of compounds in those muscle fibers that aren't normally there. And now as well, there's genetic testing available, which is nice because that's much less invasive than a muscle biopsy. They can do the genetic testing on either blood or hair samples, and some of the exertional rhabdomyolysis, I should say, just say muscle myopathies that do have genetic testing available would be HYPP, which is not really an exertional rhabdomyolysis, but the HYPP episodes look very, very similar to tying up. But anyhow, that has a genetic test, PSSM1, GBED, MYHM, and MH, and we'll go through all of these one by one, and I'll give you all the names that go with all these acronyms. So first, categorizing tying up or ER, we have sporadic versus chronic ER. And in sporadic ER, this is just a horse that ties up once or just a few times during its lifetime. It's not an over and over the horse ties up. And there does not seem to be an intrinsic muscle defect. And it could be a temporary imbalance within muscle cells. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But chronic, then, the primary susceptibility appears to be due to an intrinsic defect in the muscle. and the episodes recur over time. So the horse, you may have the horse tie up and it goes a period of time without a problem, ties up again, or it may even be a horse that just chronically on a somewhat regular basis, you have problems with tying up. And in these situations, it's proposed, in some situations, we know it's an inherited defect, but in most situations, it's proposed that there are inherited defects in muscle function, and that will predispose horses to chronic forms of exertional rhabdomyolysis. So again, sporadic ER. These are horses tie up once or only a few times, and causes, I tend to liken the causes of sporadic ER to what is seen often in humans on about January 2nd or 3rd, after everybody makes their big New Year's resolutions that this is going to be the year, going to exercise, going to diet, get in shape. And everybody goes to the gym on January 1st and January 2nd, and then everybody ties up January 3rd, 4th, and you're in great pain. You don't want to get out of bed, but the causes kind of similar in horses: inadequate warm-up, pre-existing lameness in horses. If the horse has a lameness going on and then is exercised, that the stress and the pain can cause them to tie up. Exercise to the point of fatigue, insufficient training, just the muscle soreness and injury. All these can lead to a one-time or sporadic episodes of tying up. Most frequent causes are exercise that exceeds the horse's level of training, which is one of the reasons that it's always recommended when you're going to compete your horse, getting the conditioning period of time is so important, so that that horse is not expected to perform at a level that it is not yet conditioned for. Some other issues are electrolyte imbalances, hyperthermia, or just overheating. So working a horse in, right now I'm in Kansas and it's in the mid 80s, and I swear the humidity is about 1,000%. So it's not too hard to overheat a horse by working them in the middle of the afternoon on days like this. Another issue is strenuous exercising if the horse has a viral respiratory infection going on. So all of these things can predispose a horse to just have a single episode of tying up. And if you remove those causes, don't do the same things with the horse, again, you may very well never have the horse tie up again. Now, treatment for a single episode of tying up. It is a veterinary emergency if the symptoms include any of the profuse sweating, reluctance to move. Some of these horses, they tie up so badly, you can barely even get them to walk forward. And then, of course, that dark urine, which is indicative of pretty major muscle damage. And in general, the veterinarian is most likely going to provide some kind of medication to relieve the horse's anxiety and the muscle pain, just hopefully get them to relax and not hurt. And then, of course, give them time to heal and get through these periods. And also corrections in hydration to address fluid losses. If these horses have been sweating profusely, they may very definitely need some fluids, and also the myoglobinuria that may impair the kidney function. So again, if it's a severe episode of tying up, definitely it's a good reason to get a veterinarian out there immediately. Then once the muscle pain and stiffness have resolved, well, we're going to start with stall rest. Let the horse stay quiet, not a lot of work, but once they're starting to feel a little bit better, then hand walking, turnout, because you don't want to keep the horse stationary for a hugely long time, because the muscles need to move to start, regaining their function. So prolonged stall rest is not recommended for horses after an episode of tying up. And then you may need to adjust the feeding program. A horse that is prone to tying up probably doesn't need a high grain intake. for one thing, due to their reduced work. And for the other thought is a lot of times a little bit lower soluble carb intake may be appropriate. This actually kind of goes back to the old days when it was called Monday morning disease. And you saw it in horses. These were horses that worked for a living and would work all week and get high grain rations, and then would not be working on the weekend and still get their high grain rations. And then on Monday morning, they go back to work, having rested and eaten a lot of starch and sugar all weekend. And then Monday they'd go back to work and they'd tie up. So again, a lower soluble carb intake may be appropriate for some of these horses. The training program should be resumed gradually and consistently then to prevent further muscle damage. So again, bring them back into condition and then maintain a more kind of consistent program to help prevent the tying up episodes to recur. Now, nutritional recommendations for sporadic ER. First off, we want to fortify the horse's diet with salt daily because that is one thing. Sodium is not, sometimes sodium is not adequate in a typical horse diet to meet their needs, especially when they are working hard and particularly when they are sweating hard. So daily salt fortification and then electrolytes prior to heavy sweat loss. So if you know you're going to be working your horse hard and or the temperature and humidity is leading them to sweat even more heavily, you definitely want to make sure that the horse has appropriate electrolytes. I did part of my graduate research on electrolytes, and I can tell you when a horse is exercising in hot, humid conditions, they lose a whole load of electrolytes in their sweat. And horse sweat is not like human sweat. Our sweat tends to be more dilute in electrolytes, and as we get acclimated to work and sweating, it becomes more dilute. But horses do not. Their sweat is more concentrated in electrolytes, and over time and with more work, it doesn't really become more dilute. So again, they lose a tremendous amount of electrolytes in sweat. More nutritional recommendations: adjust feed to satisfy energy needs. If the horse is working less, you need to drop the calories down. Don't be feeding calories and nutrients to support heavy work when the horse is not working heavy. Working horses do see an increased generation of free radicals from exercise-associated oxidative metabolism. It's just normal metabolism for exercise, but you do see more free radicals, and that may increase the risk of tying up. So for exercising horses, making sure they have appropriate dietary antioxidants is very important. Vitamin E, of course, is a natural antioxidant. And to tell what the horse's vitamin E status is, a blood test is your vet may run a blood test. You can also just do a ration evaluation and look at the total diet your horse is eating and how much vitamin E is provided by the different parts of the diet. The horses that exhibit low serum vitamin E can show muscle soreness, muscle tremors, muscle weakness, loss of muscle mass. And these things all you can see that's very similar to tying up and could possibly lead to tying up. So supplemental vitamin E for a hardworking horse is not at all a bad idea. And then the other thing, selenium is a natural antioxidant. There are not that many horses that tend to be selenium deficient, and a lot of people realize selenium is an antioxidant, and there are areas that have selenium deficient soils. So sometimes forages may be selenium deficient, but don't just jump in and say, gosh, I'm in an area of selenium deficiency. I need to give my horse a vitamin E and selenium supplement, because selenium also can become toxic with too much. And the few times we actually see selenium toxicity in horses is usually over supplementation of selenium. So vitamin E is a nice one because it's really hard to overdo vitamin E supplementation. Possible, but it's harder. Selenium's a little trickier. And of course, Kentucky Equine Research has some excellent products available as far as electrolytes, and also Nano E, which is a aqueous natural vitamin E source that are all very appropriate for exercising horses. Okay, so that was sporadic ER, and let's move on to chronic ER. And again, there are several different diseases, basically, conditions that cause chronic ER. Chronic ER is when horses repeatedly tie up, and it's considered a chronic condition. Most common trigger for the chronic ER is actually less than 20 minutes of light exercise, particularly if the horse has been rested for several days prior to exercise or is unfit. Now, research is ongoing on all these different causes of chronic ER. In 2011, there were 4 specific causes recognized. Now in 2021, we've got at least 5 causes and counting, because there are some causes that are named, but quite honestly, it's kind of an inclusive name that most likely over time and more research, there are going to be more specific types of muscle myopathies that fall within those the named bucket. So I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Just general management of chronic ER, because I'm not going to go back on each of the specific types of ER and say, okay, these are the things to offer to the horse, because it would become very repetitive. So I'm just going to, just in general for chronic ER. First off, you got to evaluate the exercise program and make sure that there's appropriate conditioning for the workload, and then consistency throughout the exercise program. And then dietary management. In general, the ration should meet all the nutritional needs, the calories, protein, vitamins, and minerals to support the workload for that particular horse and that particular type of activity. So you want to make sure you're meeting all the basic nutrient requirements. And then within that, you need to look at appropriate calorie sources for the workload and the specific diagnosed muscle myopathy, because some of these different muscle myopathies actually require a lower soluble carb intake versus a moderate soluble carb intake. Some require a higher fat intake. Some, the higher fat is not appropriate. So figuring out what type of muscle myopathy you're dealing with, and then figuring out what the calorie sources to try to address and manage that muscle myopathy is very important. And again, salt and electrolytes is appropriate, as I mentioned before. And then finally, supplement to support metabolic and exercise demands on muscle tissue, which would be the antioxidants. And for these chronic ER horses, not only the vitamin E supplementation, but coenzyme Q10 has also been shown to be a potent antioxidant and help with the muscle metabolism in exercising horses. So these are 2 supplements available from KER. Let me give my dog a treat. So she will stop. Yes, she loves her liver treats. So she'll stop barking at people across the street. So anyhow, Nano E and Nano Q10 are excellent supplements that have great research behind them for horses with muscle myopathies. Okay, so first chronic ER would be recurrent exertional rhabdomyolysis, or RER. This one is primarily seen in thoroughbreds and sometimes in standardbreds and Arabians. The research points to it being a heritable condition, so it can be inherited in thoroughbreds. We see it particularly in excitable young fillies, and probably heritable in standardbreds, but the inheritance has not been conclusively defined. So it's something that people have looked at bloodlines and said, yeah, there seems to be a pattern here, but the genetics have not been defined at this point. 5 to 10% of thoroughbred racehorses develop tying up each season, and approximately 13% of polo horses tie up during a year. Now, I realize y'all are primarily riding quarter horses or stock type horses, But I wanted to talk about RER because in the running quarter horses, a lot of times there is quite a bit of thoroughbred blood. So when I'm doing a consult with someone who's got a barrel racer, for instance, and is having tying up problems, one of my first questions is, okay, it's a quarter horse, I got that. But if you look back at the papers, how much thoroughbred are we talking about? Because in some situations, we may be dealing with RER rather than some of the more traditional quarter horse ERs, such as PSSM. But RER is actually an abnormal intracellular calcium regulation issue. It's not completely understood at this time, but whereas people tend to be familiar with PSSM and the sugar and starch level, RER is not as tied to dietary sugar and starch. Again, it's calcium regulation. And of course, the symptoms, typical tying up, muscle stiffness, reluctance to move, painful, profuse sweating. The veterinary diagnosis of RER and then treatment, basically, you may do a muscle biopsy, but a lot of times it's just observation and blood testing, and then management to make the horse comfortable and prevent further stress and muscle damage, which may include sedatives to just calm them down. As I said before, it tends to be nervous, young thoroughbred fillies, so kind of calming them down. And then there are some prescription drugs to help manage the intracellular sodium and calcium. Long-term treatment and management of these horses would be to put them on an appropriate diet. And in this case, nutritionally balanced diet to supply appropriate calories, protein, vitamins, and minerals. Recommend 1.5 to 2% of their body weight in forage. In some of these race horses, they may get down to about 1% of their body weight in forage because they need so many calories that they have to get those calories in the feed, which is much more calorically dense than the forages are. But in the feed, we want to restrict the dietary starch and sugar. Now, I'm not saying low starch and sugar because these horses can handle and do need some starch and sugar in their diets because that's the source of their muscle fuel. But we want to restrict the starch and sugar and replace some of the starch and sugar with calories from added fat. So basically, out of the total daily calories provided, we want about 20% or less of their digestible energy or their calories supplied by starch, and at least 15% of their digestible energy supplied by fat. I want to point out, this does not mean a feed that is less than 20% starch and 15% fat. This means the calories provided by starch, less than 20% of the total calories come from starch. So it's a whole different calculation. And so when this information first came out, I was getting calls saying, I need a feed that is less than 20% starch and more than 50. I was getting people who said, and a feed that has 20% fat. And if you think about a feed that is 20% fat, if you're feeding 5 pounds of feed, that means a whole pound of that feed is fat. Can you imagine what your horse would think if you gave them that kind of feed? They would say, bleh, fat is not unpalatable, but it gets to a certain point that they flat won't eat it. So again, and I'll mention this again at the end, but KER.com, please feel free on any of these things to contact us at KER, and we will be happy to sort through the information with you and help you make sure that your horse is on an appropriate diet. Okay, and then finally, treatment for RER is frequent turnout, daily exercise, consistent schedule. One of the things these horses like is consistency in their day, consistency in their life. So if things don't change too much, they tend to not have tying up episodes. Now, of course, if you're hauling a horse down the road, whether it's for a barrel race or a thoroughbred racehorse, it's hard to have that consistent, daily lifestyle. But as much as you can, keeping things consistent will help those horses and minimize the chance of tying up. Okay, polysaccharide storage myopathy. This is a pretty common one in quarter horses. And over the past several years, there have been several acronyms. PSSM, which is what we typically call it these days, but for a while then it was also EPSM, equine polysaccharide storage myopathy, and then EPSSM, which is also equine polysaccharide storage myopathy. And it basically depended on what lab or veterinary practice was discussing the polysaccharide storage myopathy. But again, research has continued, and I want to give a shout out to Dr. Stephanie Valberg, who's now at Michigan State University, and she has done the lion's share of research on these muscle myopathies, including PSSM1, and she actually is the one who identified PSSM1, and more recently, we'll talk about myofibrillar myopathy. And she developed the genetic test for PSSM1. So her lab has done a huge amount of research in this field. PSSM is a glycogen. Glycogen is a muscle. It's basically the sugar that's stored in the muscle in the form of glycogen, and that is the major fuel source for a working muscle. But it's a glycogen storage disorder. And what they see in the muscle biopsy, when they look at the muscle cells, there's an accumulation of an abnormal polysaccharide in the muscle. So the abnormal polysaccharide forms in those muscle fibers because of the increased activity of glycogen synthase, which is the enzyme that primarily is responsible for the synthesis of glycogen, which that's kind of what its name says. It's the synthase is the enzyme that makes glycogen. So in PSSM1, because there's two types of PSSM that are identified and separate today, but PSSM1, that abnormal polysaccharide is amylase resistant. Amylase is the enzyme that typically breaks down the polysaccharide, but in PSSM1, the abnormal polysaccharide is resistant to the breakdown by amylase. And that is the one that the genetic mutation has been identified. Now, PSSM2, you still see abnormal polysaccharides in the muscle fibers, but they're typically amylase sensitive. So they will break down in the presence of amylase. And at this point, no common genetic mutations or biochemical aberrations are defined. So PSSM2 is still kind of a bucket term. There may be more than, there may be multiple types of PSSM or muscle myopathies within the bucket term of PSSM2, but PSSM1 is pretty well genetically described and better understood today. So again, PSSM1 is caused by a genetic mutation, and it is in the glycogen synthase 1 gene. So I don't expect you guys to be geneticists, and actually I'm a nutritionist, not a geneticist. So I let the genetics experts talk about the actual genetics of these things, but just to let you know, Dr. Valberg actually was the researcher who determined that is what the genetic mutation was in PSSM1 horses. So this abnormal polysaccharide forms in the muscle fibers because of the increased activity of the glycogen synthase, and then the polysaccharide is not broken down in normal exercise. So you get these accumulations of polysaccharide in the muscle fibers, and that is actually what causes the horses, when you ask them to work and their muscle fibers are not firing and contracting properly, and the horses become painful and tying up. Again, the genetic cause has been identified. So clinical signs of PSSM1, pretty typical: tying up symptoms, firm, painful muscles, stiffness, skin twitching, sweating, weakness, reluctant to move with light exercise. And in the blood test, there will show the elevated serum creatine kinase and aspartate transferase levels. The veterinary diagnosis is usually, traditionally it was based on muscle biopsy. And then with the muscle biopsy, you can see in the pictures on this slide, which are from Dr. Valberg's lab, the muscle fiber cross section on the left is a normal cell. After exercise, the glycogen is broken down, and on the right side of the screen, you can see those dark cells, and that's the abnormal glycogen that is not broken down in those muscle fibers. And again, there is a genetic test now for this GYS1 mutation that can be performed on either whole blood or hair root samples, and again, much less invasive than a muscle biopsy. So veterinary treatment is going to be similar to sporadic ER or RER, medications to relax, relieve pain, IV fluids if needed, appropriate rest, and gradual return to work. And then this one, we really want to make sure it's managed properly to help reduce the risk of recurrent episodes. So for PSSM1, low dietary starch and sugar is very, very helpful, because the starch and sugar in the diet is what provides the substrate for that muscle glycogen to be built. So if there's less starch and sugar in the diet, you're reducing the risk of that abnormal polysaccharide to be built in the muscle fibers. So these horses still need calories, they still need the fuel sources, but you can replace the starch, some of the starch and sugar calories with calories from added fat, because the fat does not help build glycogen or the abnormal polysaccharide. And I got to say, you can't, if you've got a working horse, you can't take all the sugar and starch away, because they do need some of that for muscle glycogen. So for PSSM1, your feed, and now I'm talking about the actual feed, the percent of NSC in the feed and the percent of fat in the feed. So in your feed, less than 15% NSC, which is starch plus sugars, and high fat if that's appropriate, maybe 10 to 12% fat. And I say if it's appropriate because some of these PSSM horses are very easy keepers. So if you start putting a lot of fat in the diet, that's a lot of calories. And if you've got an easy keeper that basically stays fat on air, you don't want to add a whole bunch of extra calories to the diet. So we want to make sure that we're feeding the right feed. So for a hardworking, harder keeper, then you want to have a lower sugar starch, higher fat feed, such as KER's Relieve. However, if it's an easy keeper, you might then want to have a ration balancer such as All Phase. And then if your horse is an easy keeper and you can keep the weight off and increase the exercise so that some supplemental fat may help, in that case, you can come back with a little bit of fat supplement, like vegetable oil, 120 to 140 milliliters per day to supplement that fat without excess calories. For PSSM1, daily exercise is extremely important. Getting those horse, of course, they have to rest immediately after a tying up episode, but you want to gradually bring them back to exercise, and then you want to keep that exercise going, because exercise has been shown to help reduce the abnormal polysaccharide in the muscles. So again, that's extremely important of management of these PSSM1 horses. Now, PSSM type 2. This is the one that's now kind of the bucket term. So it represents one or possibly more forms of muscle disease other than PSSM1 that are characterized by the abnormal staining for the muscle glycogen and microscopic examination of muscle biopsies. But if you do the genetic test, the cause is not that GYS1 mutation. So you do the genetic test, there's a muscle biopsy, you see the abnormal polysaccharide, but the genetic test is negative, then you say, oh, okay, then it's type 2 PSSM. But the genetic cause or causes are not yet identified. There's no scientifically validated evidence that any available genetic testing is linked to PSSM2, or actually MFM, which I will talk about next. So we don't have a genetic test. And again, it's kind of a bucket term for these horses. And actually, as I go through, I'm going to start separating out PSSM2 for quarter horse or stock type horses, versus warm bloods because they're looking a little bit different. So the clinical signs for quarter horses and sometimes Arabians, you're going to see the firm, painful muscles, a more typical tying up episode, stiffness, skin twitching, sweating, weakness, reluctance to move with light exercising. So basically what we kind of expect for tying up. You tend to see elevated serum creatine kinase and aspartate transferase levels. And in the quarter horses, sometimes you just see high serum creatine kinase activity, and sometimes you will see in these horses muscle atrophy. So the veterinary diagnosis, again on the muscle biopsy, it may show abnormal accumulations of glycogen, not always, but it may. But again, on the DNA test, there's no defined genetic mutation. So the pictures on the bottom of this one are, again, from Dr. Valberg's lab. And you can see the normal stain for glycogen on the left, and a stain for glycogen from a horse with PSSM2 is on the right. So you can see that there are some abnormal aggregates of muscle glycogen in these horses, but that's not always the case. And again, when there are abnormal accumulations of glycogen in these horses, the glycogen is sensitive to the enzyme that breaks down glycogen. So it's a different thing than PSSM1. Now, clinical signs in warm bloods seem to be a little bit different. And in warm bloods, you will see occasional tying up with high serum CK, but most common in the warm bloods is just kind of poor performance without elevations in serum creatine kinase activity. So it looks a little bit different. And the veterinary diagnosis in this case, the muscle biopsy may not show any higher than normal muscle glycogen concentrations. In the DNA test, no defined genetic mutations. And so this is a quote from Dr. Valberg's lab. This may well be a group of conditions that have separate causes, but share common findings of the appearance of glycogen accumulation in muscle samples and poor performance. So again, a bucket term. And when someone talks to me about a horse that's been diagnosed with PSSM2, then I go to, okay, what breed is your horse? What are the symptoms? What is your veterinarian finding? And so what direction are we going to go in recommendations for management? So treatment and management for quarter horses with diagnosed with PSSM2 are going to be similar to the recommendations for PSSM1. The management, low dietary starch and sugar, replaced with calories supplied with added fat, so should sound fairly familiar. And again, concentrates less than 15% NSC, high fat if appropriate. If the daily intake is low for an easy keeper, maybe a ration balancer and some supplemental fat if that might help. Again, consistent exercise is extremely important. And this condition in quarter, it's not completely understood at this point. There is research ongoing. So hopefully in the next few years, we will learn more about it. But again, we may find out that there's more than one genetic issue that are causing the PSSM2 and tying up symptoms. Now, treatment and management of warm bloods and Arabians is going to be very different than what we recommend for the quarter horses. And it's actually similar to recommendations for MFM or myofibrillar myopathy, which I'm going to talk about next. And management also will cover in the myofibrillar myopathy. So these are horses that we're going to treat as if they had myofibrillar myopathy, but in the diagnosis, they don't, I'll talk about it in just a moment, but they don't present the same as the MFM horses. So, and here we are now at the MFM horses. So MFM, and again, if you guys are pretty much all have quarter horses, you're probably not going to be dealing with MFM. However, there is some testing available that will indicate the results. This is testing that there's really not good research behind it. But if you go with testing down this route, you may get a result that comes back and says, your quarter horse has been diagnosed with PSSM2 slash myofibrillar myopathy. So if you start looking at the recommendations for myofibrillar myopathy, if you have a true quarter horse, you probably need to stay with the quarter horse PSSM2 recommendations. So, but I'm going to talk about myofibrillar myopathy so you'll have an understanding if you do run into it with your own horse. And of course, some of you may have warm bloods or Arabs or endurance horses, because I know there are a lot of horse people out there who are, doing all sorts of different things. So you may have a warm blood, and this would be very appropriate for you. So previously, the MFM actually, once again, was defined by Dr. Valberg in her lab. And previously, before that, it would be just diagnosed as PSSM2, exercise intolerance and occasional episodes of tying up. But more recently, she identified it as a specific myopathy. And what you can see on this one, the muscle biopsy results are different from the PSSM muscle biopsies. There is an abnormal, it's called desmin, a compound that's found in the muscle fibers, but there's abnormal desmin deposits in the myofibrils, which result in destabilization of the muscle fiber protein filaments. That these are the myofibrils are the contractile filaments in the muscle, and when you get these abnormal desmin deposits, then the muscle contraction is destabilized and incorrect, and that is causes discomfort to these horses. So the clinical signs of MFM, in general, there's an unwillingness to go forward, an inability to achieve or maintain collection, reduced capacity for routine work, and difficulty with upward transitions to the canter. And this was first really seen in warm bloods, and especially like dressage horses, that they just weren't performing. They would get up to a level of performance, and then they'd either stall or they'd drop backwards because things just were getting uncomfortable, and they weren't flowing, and they weren't moving, and they weren't picking up their canter the way they used to. So again, in warm bloods, muscle pain, stiffness, vague hind limb lameness. And for MFM, the veterinary diagnosis is based, again, on the muscle biopsy, and then the specific staining technique on this muscle biopsy, which is different than when the staining for the glycogen in PSSM 1 and 2. In this staining technique, they find abnormal desmin deposits in these muscle fibers. So, and you can see this is, again, another round of pictures from Dr. Valberg. And this is cross sections of muscle cells. And on the left, there's a healthy horse. And in the center, there's a horse with diagnosed MFM showing those desmin aggregates in the muscle fiber. And then this is the lovely thing in working with KER. Dr. Valberg works closely with Dr. Joe Pagan, who is the founder and owner of Kentucky Equine Research. And he works with Dr. Valberg in developing some of these dietary management programs and supplements to address some of these muscle myopathies. And so most recently, Dr. Pagan and Dr. Valberg worked together on the MFM pellet, which is a specific amino acid supplement. It's a very unique amino acid profile that has been shown. You can see the muscle fibers on the right. This is a horse that has been on the MFM pellet, and you can see the desmin aggregation has reduced. So this is a horse that has really been helped by having the specific amino acids in the diet. Now, the treatment for MFM, appropriate exercise program, suggested initial work to stretch the top line, gradually increase and build the horse up before asking for more collected work. And then management, 1.5 to 2% of their body weight per day of good quality hay, And there's some specific recommendations for the hay or forage. And then the concentrate products, and this is what is interesting, it's products with moderate levels of NSC and lower 4 to 6% fat, because what has been seen in these horses with MFM is that higher fat levels tend to increase the oxidative stress in the muscles. And so 2 things here: providing these horses with adequate antioxidants, which would be vitamin E, coenzyme Q10, and then also very specific amino acids to help support these muscle fibers has really been shown to help these horses. So the sugar starch level is not as concerning in MFM horses, so they can have moderate levels of sugar starch. That's what's recommended, and then lower. I've seen 4 to 6% fat, possibly 4 to 8% fat, depends on how much total feed those horses are eating. But again, you don't want to go to town and feed a whole lot of added fat, because that's counterindicated in these horses. Okay, I need to take a quick drink here of my water.
And guys, feel free to comment with some questions if you have any, and I'll try to catch them as they go by, and we can ask a few questions at the end.
And I got to give another liver treat to the dog. She's going to learn that during these meetings, if she barks, she gets a liver treat. But okay, so we've now talked about the main exertional rhabdomyolysis conditions. But I did want to throw in HYPP, which is not really exertional, but HYPP episodes look pretty much like tying up. And I have had people who call for a consult and their horse has been diagnosed with PSSM1 and HYPP. And they say, so how do I feed them? And the feeding recommendations are kind of different, even though the syndrome looks similar. So hyperkalemic periodic paralysis is a genetic mutation that disrupts the sodium ion channel and results in high blood potassium. Potassium and sodium go back and forth across cell membranes. And so this disrupts that activity, and you end up with potassium, too much potassium in the blood, when you want it to be pushed back inside the cells. Now, it is a genetic mutation, and I have a picture of the quarter horse Impressive, because Impressive had the point mutation. He's not the cause of all HYPP in the world, but in the quarter horse world, yes, most horses that show HYPP do go back to Impressive. It is a dominant gene with incomplete dominance, which means the horses that are NN, which show that have neither of the HYPP genes, and they are perfectly normal. The NH, one gene is normal, and then the other is HYPP, and those horses may or may not have HYPP episodes, and that's the incomplete dominance. A true dominant gene, if the gene was present at all, that horse would be absolutely show the characteristic. So the NH horses may not, but are usually less hard to manage than the heterozygous HH horses. And of course, an HYPP episode is characterized by sporadic attacks of muscle tremors, shaking or trembling, weakness, possibly collapse, which again, in many cases, it looks a whole lot like tying up. Horses may exhibit severe signs of the disease to little or no symptoms, and episodes may be triggered by stress, diet, changes in exercise routine, and of course, high levels of potassium then are problematic for these horses. So diagnosis and treatment, the definitive diagnosis is DNA testing with hair samples with roots. Treatment or management, number one is to manage the dietary potassium. So horses need potassium. You can't take it completely out of the diet, but It's been recommended anywhere from 0.6 to 1.5% potassium in the total diet. But through working with HYPP horses, one of the main things is consistency in potassium in the diet, because a big change can trigger an episode. And one of the tricky things here is that forages can be highly variable in potassium levels. When I was doing my one of my electrolyte studies back in Texas, and I was feeding Bermuda grass hay, and of course, the hay provides the electrolytes, sodium and potassium and chloride, and I had 2 batches of coastal Bermuda grass, and when I analyzed them at the end of the study, one batch had more than 2% potassium, and the other batch had about half that much. So these are just 2 batches of hay that, huge variation in the potassium. So you got to be careful with that with these HYPP horses. Now in this situation, a moderate soluble carb intake may be helpful, because there is a thought that the blood glucose from the soluble carbs in the diet can help push the potassium back into the cells where you want it to be. So this is not one that you need to be really, really low sugar starch, which, as I said, this is one of the times it's contraindicated if you've got a horse with PSSM1 and HYPP. Then we kind of have to say, okay, what exactly are we going to try and manage and feed for? However, frequent turnout, regular exercise is also important for these horses, same as PSSM horses. Avoid fluctuations in potassium intake and changes in feed, and work with the veterinarian. There are drug therapies for these horses. And of course, now, since people know about the genetics, then you can breed to minimize the risks of HYPP. Okay, now other muscle myopathies, because as I mentioned early on, there are a bunch of muscle myopathies. Some of them have DNA tests available, some do not. So just in case somebody, you get a diagnosis or somebody says, oh, you've got tying up, maybe it's one of these things. So myosin heavy chain myopathy, MYHM, it's the most common cause of rapid atrophy of the top line in quarter horses and paint horses. So this is a genetic mutation. It's present in about 7% of quarter horses, most common in reining, working cow horses, and halter horses. So 16 to 20% of these guys are carriers. It is a genetic mutation. There's a test available. I will mention a lot of, and I have a resources slide, but UC Davis does a lot of this genetic testing, and they do have a little panel that has, for quarter horses, that has the 5 common quarter horse genetic mutations that they, if you have concern, that would be one of the places. And of course, Dr. Valberg's lab also does genetic testing. So those are 2 good places to look if you need to have DNA testing done. Okay, glycogen branching enzyme deficiency, or GBED. This causes muscle weakness in quarter horses and related breeds. It is a fatal genetic disorder that results from the inability to correctly store glycogen in several organs of the body. So the clinical presentation is variable, but usually you see late-term abortion or stillbirth in GBED. And recent research suggests at least 3% of abortions in quarter horses are due to GBED. So if you are in the breeding business, it is a genetic mutation. There's a test available. It might be something worth thinking about for your breeding quarter horses. Malignant hyperthermia. This is a muscle myopathy that is sometimes associated with an exertional rhabdomyolysis. It's an inherited disease in which affected horses can be triggered by halogenated anesthetics, succinylcholine, stress, or excitement, and it can induce a hypermetabolic state characterized by symptoms including muscle contracture, elevated temperature, and an irregular heart rhythm. Again, genetic mutation test is available, and there are times that malignant hyperthermia has been associated with PSSM. So if you've got a horse diagnosed with PSSM, but when it ties up, it has really severe tying up. Again, this is a genetic test that might be helpful to find out in your horse. Now, this one is not genetic. Atypical myopathy is a sycamore myopathy. This is actually one I had never run into before, but I found it very interesting. It's a severe and often fatal muscle disorder caused by ingesting sycamore seeds, leaves, or seedlings. You know, you get those little helicopters, and if your horse eats a bunch of them, it can cause a fatal muscle disorder. So might not want to graze your horses around sycamore trees. Some horses appear to be more susceptible than others. So it may be something that there is a genetic predisposition. It's fatal for around 3/4 of affected horses, and it's hypoglycin A toxin, which is in the seeds and in the plants, and the concentrations vary between plant samples derived from different trees or seedlings. So there may be a sycamore tree that's not problematic, but it's just kind of interesting to be aware of. And then finally, I wanted to cover shivers, because historically, shivers was kind of thought to be some sort of polysaccharide storage myopathy. And we would recommend similar dietary management for shivers, lower sugar, starch, etc. However, recently, and I first learned about the newer research from Dr. Valberg, shivers is more likely related to abnormal cerebellar function. Basically, it's a neuropathy rather than a muscle disease. And it's a lesion on the spine. And if the horse is truly diagnosed with shivers, there's really not a lot nutritionally we can do. There are veterinarians that have some programs that are said to help with the symptoms of shivers, but it's a whole different thing. It's not a muscle myopathy, but I think there's still a lot of people out there who feel that it is and try to treat it that way. So, take-home message: general management of tying up, veterinary diagnosis and treatment, of course. When the horse ties up, my first recommendation is call your veterinarian and alleviate that particular episode, and then work with your veterinarian to determine what caused that episode. And then an appropriate diet and exercise program to try and help manage that specific muscle myopathy. And supplement is recommended. Electrolytes for working horses, making sure that the dietary salt and electrolyte intake is appropriate. And then for working horses, antioxidants. And then, of course, for MFM and warm bloods, PSSM2, we do recommend specific amino acid supplementation, such as the MFM pellet. And I did want to offer some really good resources on tying up, because I've been digging through muscle myopathies now for several months, learning more and more about them as the research is ongoing. There is a lot of good information on the KER website. So if you go to KER.com, then search for a specific myopathy or tying up or a keyword, and there are a lot of articles on the website. And then Dr. Valberg's lab, it's cvm.msu.edu, but I just went to Google. If you go to Google and search for exertional rhabdomyolysis Valberg, it's going to take you to all sorts of great information that is put out by her lab on the MSU website. And then specifically the quarter horse myopathies, there's a lot of good information on the UC Davis website. So there I Googled whatever specific muscle myopathy I was looking for, and then UC Davis. And there's an example of on the website, one of the articles I got to. And just, again, some really great resources. When you Google, gotta warn you, there's some really scary resources out there. So I tend to look at the science-based resources. If the website ends with .edu, you're usually going to one of the universities, and that's usually pretty good information. And of course, at Kentucky Equine Research, we really work to make sure that everything presented there is based in research and good, solid information. So we really don't want horse owners going down. You can get in a scary ditch pretty quick. So final take-home message: there is a member discount, 10% off products. the KER products. So you can use the code WPRA21. And thank you much for joining and taking your time. And I would be more than happy to attempt to answer any questions.
Well, thank you so much. That was a lot of really great information. And who would have thought there's so many different ways for your horse to tie up and all these different
it's amazing, isn't
different
it?
issues. So for those of you listening, if you do have some questions, feel free to type them in the comments. I'll try to catch them as they go by. Or, you know, if you think about things later, you can always send WPRA a message or Kentucky Equine Research a message. And they've got really great, you know, items on their website, as Dr. Young was talking about, at KER.com. So a thought of mine is, you know, with the summer rodeos coming up, there's long hauls happening, a lot of matinee performances where it's 2 o'clock and 90 degrees and things like that. So, you know, it sounds like something that's really important is, you know, to keep their electrolytes up, to have a lot of vitamin E, to make sure they've got time to move around and stuff during those trailering things. Does that sound correct? Are there other things that you would suggest during these long haul periods?
Absolutely. The other thing I would say, hydration, hydration, hydration. Make sure your horse is drinking water. There are some different ways, especially when the horse is on a trailer and you're hauling down the road. Sometimes it's really hard to get those horses to drink water. So there's a lot of suggestions on like flavoring the water, so the water is always the same. One of the things I really like, there's a product out there that it's called hydration hay. And in my previous life, it was developed and is a great product. And the whole product was bought by another small company, but it's still available. And they're 2-pound hay blocks that absorb up to 10 pounds of water. So you can have a bucket with this hay water mush that horses usually love. And that way they're basically eating their water. So down the road, you can have a bucket of hay mush that they're eating in the trailer. And by all means, when you get where you're going, make sure they have clean, fresh water available all the time. Yeah, electrolyte supplementation and anything you can do to help those horses feel like they're on a consistent schedule, and as much as possible, keep things the same, keep their feeding times the same, keep their actual feed the same and their hay the same, and all of those things with consistency and regular exercise, and make sure they're conditioned. And part of it too, make sure, if you can, make sure they're acclimated to that hot, humid weather. Because, you know, I know you're in Colorado. Boy, if you took a horse from Colorado right now down to South Central Texas and expected it to get out and really work hard, that would be tough. So keep those things in mind. And I kind of think about it as, you know, how am I going to feel when I'm asked to get out and work in the heat and humidity? And what do I need to do to make sure that I'm prepared for it? And those same sort of things you want to take care of for your horse.
Definitely. This one might be a little bit difficult to answer because there are so many different types and causes of tying up. But have you ever seen, or is there any kind of correlation between like a mare's heat cycle and a higher incidence of them tying up or anything like that?
That would pertain more to the recurrent exertional rhabdomyolysis that you see in the young thoroughbred fillies. And in that, there has been some kind of anecdotal evidence that the heat cycle seems to be tied up. That was an unintentional pun. There seems to be some relationship with the heat cycle and the tying up episodes with those fillies. However, there's not been a defined relationship in research at this point. However, it's something to be aware of. I'm not really aware of any relationship in any of the other muscle myopathies, other than, and this is just, you know, my own thought process, if you've got a mare that tends to be more stressed, more hyper, just more wound up when she's in heat, that kind of stress, I would think if she is suffering from one of the muscle myopathies, that additional stress may predispose her to, a tying up episode. So something to be aware of. And if you do have one of those personalities, make sure, again, horse is on the appropriate diet, regular exercise, and all of the management tips to help minimize the risk of tying up.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, I think that's all the questions we have at this moment. Like I said, if you have more, always feel free to message us on Facebook. We'll get you the correct answer. And there's lots of great resources on that website, KER.com. And just remember, you have a WPRA member discount, which is use the code WPRA21. And I think that's it for today.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And we'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.